That was the first time NATO was going to act militarily out of area of the territory of NATO as defined in the original treaty. And the reason why NATO wanted to, and the European allies in NATO wanted to act, is that the humanitarian situation in Kosovo and Bosnia was absolutely terrible. Milosevic was practically trying to annihilate all the population there. And the instability in the area was affecting practically the whole of Europe. So the European allies decided it was the right time to use NATO militarily. It was a rather difficult decision to take. It was acting out of area. The Americans were rather doubtful. But in the end, they decided to help the European allies, and that's how the whole thing came about. And NATO, as I said before, for the first time, decided to act militarily out of area. That was a first in the alliance history. The NATO countries were in a rather difficult position, and the NATO parliaments as well, because the public opinion was divided, was very deeply divided about what to do, how to do it, and whether to intervene or not to intervene. Again, it was the first time that was going to be done. It was going to be done without a proper endorsement of the Security Council, on the part of the Security Council, mainly because the Russians were against, so there was a Russian veto. But at the same time, it was what the international community had started to define as to the need to intervene whenever there was going to be a catastrophe in humanitarian terms somewhere in the world. So for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, it was a rather difficult decision. I was the president at the time. I had to put together all the things I could do because I felt that it was the right time for the Assembly to come in support and in favor of the decisions taken by the governments. I knew very well that there were a number of doubts, ditherings, and that it could be argued both ways. But I felt at the same time that if there was one time when NATO as such, the governments needed support from the Parliamentary Assembly, was that time. So I worked together with a number of allies. It did help the fact that Javier Solana, a good friend of mine, was the Secretary General of the Assembly at that time. Certainly he did play his role as well. And well, we came very much in favor of the intervention. I wouldn't say the majority was very large, but it was a sufficient majority to show support for the decisions of the alliance. I think that was a very wise decision to take, in spite of all the doubts, because that opened the way to a number of future interventions by NATO outside the area of NATO, be it in Afghanistan, be it in several other places in the world. And at the end of the day, NATO played a very substantial role in stabilizing the area. And I think that, that from that viewpoint, we should be glad we took the decision we took, helping and supporting the governments in NATO to intervene in Kosovo at the time. Well, in general, what we learned is that NATO was called to play a rather significant role, not only in the North Atlantic area, which was the one defined in the Washington Treaty, but in general around the world as a stabilizing factor. After all, there was a very powerful military machine, there was a very powerful political machine. We were going through a number of difficulties around the world because of, well, the disappearance of Yugoslavia on one side, because of a number of instabilities in some other areas. And what we learned in the Parliamentary Assembly, it was the time at the same time when the Parliamentary Assembly was about to open the membership to new members. Let's remember as well that the Soviet Union was about to disappear, that had practically disappeared. The number of new members were coming, former members of the Warsaw Pact were becoming members of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, of NATO as such. So what we learned is that the world was far larger than we had originally imagined through the Washington Treaty, that we were no longer 6 or 14 or 15, but we were practically more than 20, now 28 member countries with a different approach to international relations. And we learned how to look at large at the world, and the world was in many different ways in need of NATO. So that's what we learned, that NATO was conceived for a rather limited area in Europe, but was needed in a far larger area. And that was the main lesson. That was the big lesson. That was a very positive lesson we learned in those years.